Judge Thornton assumed he was overseeing a trial of a haughty tycoon until Nicholas Rio started dismantling the case like a seasoned attorney. Before delving into the narrative, share your location in the comments and be sure to subscribe to catch the latest tales. The federal courtroom hummed with energy, illuminated by the glare of reporters' cameras, as Nicholas Rio, age 59, entered. The real estate magnate and spouse of White House Press Secretary Karoline Leavitt exuded composure despite facing allegations of real estate fraud involving a $10 million land transaction. Whispers rippled through the onlookers, suggesting this wasn't merely a legal battle, but a political strike against Leavitt, an emerging figure in the White House. Rio, once homeless, had forged a formidable real estate empire through relentless effort and intellect. Countless nights spent mastering real estate law to safeguard his business had become his greatest asset. Outside the courtroom, Leavitt stood resolute amid a media frenzy, her gaze unwavering with steadfast belief in her husband. Their age difference, once fodder for gossip, was irrelevant now. Only the undeniable truth mattered. And it was unfolding in this courtroom. The courtroom crackled with anticipation, murmurs echoing beneath the lofty ceiling. Snow dusted the windows, faint light casting shadows on the gleaming wooden benches crowded with spectators, reporters scribbling feverishly, political operatives exchanging sly glances, and locals intrigued by the scandal surrounding Karoline Leavitt's husband. At the defendant's table, Nicholas Rio sat poised, his tailored suit a sharp contrast to the surrounding turmoil. His keen eyes flicked from the judge's bench to the prosecution's table, where Richard Langston adjusted his tie with a smug grin, exuding the confidence of someone assured of triumph. Judge Edward Thornton, glasses resting low on his nose, regarded Rio with disdain. Arrogant businessman, he muttered to himself, tapping the desk lightly as he leaned back in his chair, his robe rustling while he leafed through the case file with deliberate leisure. His lips twitched into a smirk, revealing his assumption that this was a straightforward trial. "Mr. Rio," he intoned, his voice laced with scorn, "I trust you're ready to defend yourself, or are you banking on your wife's prominence to speak for you?" Snickers erupted from the crowd, particularly from those eager to see Leavitt's reputation tarnished. Rio's jaw tightened, but he remained silent, letting the taunts from the back row fade into the background. Karoline Leavitt observed from the gallery, hands clasped tightly in her lap, her composed demeanor concealing a tempest of emotions. She knew a guilty verdict would not only devastate Rio's legacy, but also embolden her political foes, who were already flooding social media with accusations branding her husband as corrupt. Yet her trust in Rio, forged through years of partnership, remained unshaken. She caught his eye for a fleeting moment, a silent exchange of strength, and gave a subtle nod, urging him to press on. Thornton leaned forward, hands steepled. "Let's keep this brief," he said, glancing at his watch. "I haven't the patience for a self-styled billionaire's theatrics of untouchability." The sarcasm landed, eliciting more laughter, but Rio remained unfazed. He had faced harsher critics, bankers who ridiculed his early ventures, competitors who underestimated his resolve. This courtroom was merely another battlefield, and he was prepared. Richard Langston rose, his polished shoes clicking on the floor as he approached the bench. "Your Honor," he declared, his voice smooth and practiced, carrying the authority of someone accustomed to winning cases through charisma and selective facts. "The prosecution will demonstrate that Nicholas Rio masterminded a brazen scheme to defraud his business partner, Mr. Harold Grayson, in a $10 million land deal." He gestured to a stack of documents on the table. "We possess a contract bearing Rio's forged signature, inflating the property's value, and financial records revealing dubious transfers through his company, Coastal Ventures." Langston paced before the jury, his eyes gleaming with assurance. This wasn't an error, ladies and gentlemen. This was greed, calculated, deliberate, executed by a man who believed wealth could mask his crimes. He turned to Rio, his smile cold. "The evidence is irrefutable, the contract, bank records, and testimony from Mr. Grayson, who trusted Rio and was betrayed. The jury leaned in, some nodding, swayed by Langston's conviction. In the crowd, a reporter typed furiously, drafting a headline, "Leavitt's husband faces ruin in fraud case." Thornton nodded approvingly, his mocking smile giving way to satisfaction. "Proceed, counselor," he said, his tone implying the case was already settled. He glanced at Rio, expecting a defeated slump, but saw only a man sitting upright, hands calmly folded. Rio's mind raced, dissecting Langston's every word. The contract. He hadn't signed it. The transfers. Legal and audited. Grayson's testimony. Likely the word of an old adversary, possibly paid off. Years of navigating real estate battles had sharpened Rio's instincts, and he sensed vulnerabilities in Langston's polished narrative. Langston brandished the contract before the jury. "This document bearing the defendant's signature is a cornerstone of the fraud. It falsely valued a dilapidated coastal property at $10 million, securing Rio a loan he never intended to repay." He paused, letting the accusations sink in. When confronted by Grayson, Rio concealed the truth through a network of shell companies. The crowd murmured, the image of a cunning billionaire taking shape. A woman in the back whispered to her neighbor, "Looks like he thought he'd get away with it." Karoline clenched her fists, struggling to maintain her composure. She knew Rio's meticulous nature, every deal documented, reviewed, transparent. This wasn't an error. It was a setup. She recalled late nights when Rio warned of enemies in Washington, rivals poised to exploit any vulnerability to undermine her. Scanning the crowd, she spotted a familiar face, a political operative linked to her adversaries. Her heart sank, but her resolve strengthened. Rio, meanwhile, tracked Langston's every move. The prosecutor's confidence was a tell, signaling he was overplaying his hand. Rio's self-taught legal knowledge, honed over years studying contracts and case law, whispered that the contract's authenticity was key. Metadata, signatures, edit timestamps, details Langston likely overlooked. As for Grayson's testimony, Rio recalled a bitter dispute with him years ago, a deal soured by Grayson's own schemes. Expose that, and the case would unravel. Thornton tapped his pen, impatient. "Mr. Rio, I'd assume your counsel is ready to respond," he said, his tone suggesting the defense was a mere formality. Rio's attorney, Margaret Clean, a novice public defender, fumbled with her notes, her inexperience glaring. The crowd sensed weakness, and Langston's smile widened. But Rio's eyes burned with focus. He hadn't come to be a victim. He had built an empire from nothing, married a woman the world scorned, and raised a son despite every prejudice. This courtroom, with its arrogant judge and scheming prosecutor, was just another obstacle. As Clean began to stammer a response, Rio placed a hand on her shoulder, his voice low but firm. "Let me handle it." Clean hesitated, then sat down, relieved. Rio stood, his presence commanding despite the room's scrutiny. Thornton raised an eyebrow, amused. "Eager to dig your own grave, Mr. Rio," he taunted, sparking another wave of laughter. Langston crossed his arms, waiting for the spectacle, but Rio locked eyes with Thornton, unflinching. He'd faced men like them before, arrogant, smug, blind to their own flaws. The courtroom air grew dense, as if every eye was fixed on Nicholas Rio, the man standing resolute amid a storm of derision. The mocking laughter from Judge Edward Thornton's jab still lingered, but Rio ignored it. He sensed the room's rhythm, Thornton's complacency, Langston's smug grin, and Karoline Leavitt's steadfast gaze from the spectators' seats. She sat there, hands clasped, a quiet flame amid the crowd, fueling his resolve. Margaret Clean rose, her voice trembling as she attempted to speak. "Your Honor," she fumbled through her papers, the chaotic notes betraying her lack of preparation. Langston crossed his arms, his lips curling, knowing Clean was no match. Thornton tapped his fingers on the desk, his face showing clear irritation. "Miss Clean, I hope you have something worth hearing, he said coldly, as if ready to end the session. The crowd buzzed, a few reporters jotting notes, anticipating a swift defeat for Rio. But Rio wouldn't let Klein falter further. He gently placed a hand on her shoulder, whispering, "Let me take it." Klein looked up, her eyes a mix of confusion and relief, then quietly sat down. Rio stood tall, his calm authority that of a man entering a familiar arena. He looked at Thornton, then Langston, and finally the jury, faces awaiting his collapse. "Your Honor," Rio began, his voice low and clear, cutting through the stifling air. "I request to represent myself in this case." The room seemed to hold its breath. Thornton raised an eyebrow, a flicker of surprise giving way to a mocking smile. "Represent yourself," he echoed, his tone dripping with derision. "You think this is a stage for a businessman playing lawyer?" Laughter erupted again, but it was weaker this time, as if some sensed a shift in the air. Langston let out a short, sharp laugh. "This should be entertaining," he said, turning to the jury with a look that suggested he'd already won. But Rio didn't waver. He took a step forward, adjusting his tie, a small, deliberate gesture. "I'm not here to perform," he said, his voice steady but razor-sharp. "I'm here to uncover the truth, and I'll start with a simple question for the prosecution." All eyes turned to Langston, whose smile lingered, but whose lips tightened. Rio faced him directly. "Mr. Langston, this contract you call undeniable evidence, who verified the signature on it? Has any expert been called by the court to authenticate it?" The question was a dagger, simple but piercing. Langston blinked, his smile fading for a split second. "The signature is yours, taken from company records," he replied, but his usual polish faltered. Rio nodded, as if anticipating the answer. "So, no expert," he said, turning to the jury. "A $10 million contract used to convict me, but no one checked if the signature is real. Does that sound reliable?" A few jurors exchanged glances, doubt creeping in. The crowd fell silent, sensing the shift in power. Thornton frowned, his tapping ceasing. "Careful, Mr. Rio," he warned. "You're not a lawyer, and I don't have time for guesswork." But Rio didn't stop. "I'm not guessing, Your Honor," he replied, calm but resolute. "I'm asking for transparency. If this contract is the heart of the case, why not verify it now? I move that the court order an analysis of the signature and the document's metadata." Langston shot to his feet. "Objection," he nearly shouted. This is a delay tactic, but his haste only bolstered Rio's confidence. "Delay," Rio repeated, his voice soft but cutting. "If your evidence is solid, why fear a review?" Thornton looked at Langston, his eyes narrowing. "Mr. Langston, do you have a response?" he asked, his tone tinged with suspicion. In that moment, Rio knew he'd scored a point. He recalled the long night studying law, the thick books on contracts and case law piled on his desk. He remembered Leavitt's words, spoken one quiet evening by the fireplace. "You never give up, Nick. That's why I love you." Now those words echoed, fueling him. He glanced at her, seeing her eyes shine with faith, and knew he wasn't just fighting for himself, but for their family, for their son, Nico. Langston regained his composure, but his confidence had wavered. "We'll provide additional documentation if needed," he said, but his tone lacked conviction. Rio gave a faint smile, his first of the trial. "I look forward to it," he said, returning to his seat, leaving the room stunned. Thornton looked at him, the initial mockery replaced by a spark of curiosity. The crowd began to whisper. Reporters typed frantically, and on social media, the first post appeared. Leavitt's husband just made the prosecutor sweat. The request to verify the contract's metadata hung in the air, prompting prosecutor Richard Langston to spring to his feet, hands gripping the table's edge. Judge Edward Thornton, for the first time in the trial, stopped tapping his pen, his gaze sharpening, no longer mocking but wary. Karoline Leavitt, from the spectators' seats, clasped her hands tightly, her eyes glinting with faith and worry. The crowd murmured. The scratch of reporters' pens a chaotic soundtrack. Langston, trying to regain his poise, cleared his throat. "Your Honor, this request is absurd," he said, his voice straining to sound calm, but betraying tension. "The contract was notarized by a public office. The defendant is trying to muddy the case." He turned to the jury, brandishing the document like a victory flag. "This is Rayo's signature, pulled from Coastal Bench's official records. No further analysis is needed." But his insistence didn't sway everyone. A juror, a middle-aged woman with thick glasses, frowned, as if starting to question. Rayo stood tall, his face impassive. He knew Langston was covering, and his haste was a crack in his armor. "Your Honor," he said, his voice composed but sharp as a honed blade. "If this contract is truly undeniable evidence, why does the prosecution oppose verification? A signature can be copied, a document altered. I'm only asking for confirmation to ensure fairness." He turned to the jury, his gaze connecting with each member. "Isn't that what we expect from the justice system?" Thornton furrowed his brow, hand resting on his chin. He wasn't used to a defendant challenging him, especially a businessman with no law degree. But Rayo's logic was too sound to dismiss. "Mr. Langston," he said, voice low, "does the prosecution have any reason to object to examining the document's metadata?" Langston blinked, hesitating just long enough for the jury to notice. "No. No reason, Your Honor," he replied, but his confidence had faded. Thornton nodded. "Good. I'll allow the examination. Proceed immediately." The room buzzed. A reporter in the corner typed frantically, and a social media post spread. Rio corners the prosecutor. Karoline, though maintaining her calm exterior, couldn't hide a faint smile. She knew Rio had prepared for this moment, not just through years of self-taught law, but through instincts honed in high-stakes real estate deals. He'd once told her about spotting a forged contract in a White Mountains project. Metadata saved him from $1 million lawsuit. Now he was using the same tactic to save himself. Rio didn't stop. He stepped to the defendant's table, pulling a slim folder from his leather briefcase, his gaze sweeping over Langston. "While we await the metadata results, I'd like to address the financial reports the prosecution called shady," he said, his voice steady but weighty. "These transfers, totaling $8.4 million through Coastal Benches, were described by Mr. Langston as evidence of greed. But has anyone asked what they actually were?" He held up a sheet, the light catching bolded text. "This is an independent audit report from last year, confirming every transaction was legal, transparent, and reinvested into a real estate project." Langston leaped up. "Objection. This document hasn't been submitted to the court," he shouted, his voice cracking. Rio gave a slight smile, his first hint of sharpness. "Your Honor, I submitted copies to the court clerk this morning. The prosecution was perhaps too busy to check." Thornton fixed Langston with a piercing stare. "Mr. Langston, is this true?" Langston stammered. I'll review," but his discomfort was plain as day.